She jabbed a finger into my face the moment I set my last box down on the porch, the nail finding a space just under my eyebrow, like she wanted to make sure I felt the point of it more than I heard the words. "You can't stay here. This is HOA property, and I'm the president," she barked, her voice ricocheting down the street and pinging off windows. I was still wiping sweat from my brow, breathing in the cardboard-scented air of a house that, until a week ago, had belonged to someone else. The truck's tailgate still sat open, the ramp folded against the driveway like the spine of a beached whale. The boxes were stacked in uneven columns on the porch, the tape dulled from the trips inside and out. She looked at me like she owned not just the neighborhood, but everyone who lived in it. That look, smug, territorial, practiced, was the ignition switch. It made my jaw ache with something that wasn't anger exactly, more like a stubborn refusal to be moved by someone else's script. I kept my voice steady. "Ma'am, this house isn't part of your HOA," I said. Her face tightened. She flourished a wad of papers the way conductors flourish a baton, dramatic, precise. Half-creased, half-folded, they looked like a costume prop for someone who'd been waiting to go on stage. "These rules apply to every new resident," she declared. "If you don't leave now, I'll have you arrested." Her voice carried the kind of certainty that only rehearsed people possess. She wanted an audience. The audience gathered. Neighbors peered out of curtains. Someone leaned against a mailbox. A kid on a bicycle rode by slow enough that the spokes clicked like a metronome. They all watched the drama unfold on a street that had once been the kind of place where lawnmower engines and old men's laughter formed the soundtrack. Now it had the charged pause of a courtroom. She dialed 911 with a flourish that matched the papers. "Yes, officers to 42 Pine Street," she said, loud and clear, as if the dispatcher could hear the crowd through the phone. "There's a trespasser refusing to leave my property." She said it like she was announcing the next act. What she didn't know was simple. My name was still on the original deed. I had paper that said so and ink that had dried years ago. I'd not snuck in through the back. I'd paid for this place and driven it home the way a man brings groceries into a kitchen. I wasn't a trespasser. I was a new owner. 2 patrol cars arrived faster than I expected, lights cutting across the quiet street, red and blue painting the maple leaves. Karen, because that was the name on the HOA mailbox and the tone made it part of the performance, smirked like the jury had already returned the verdict. "There he is!" she shouted, pointing like a dot on a map. One officer stepped forward while another kept one boot in respect by her side, notes at the ready. The first officer asked the mandatory questions. "Sir, do you have identification? What's your business here?" My hands were steady when I reached into the folder on my porch and pulled out the papers, originals, sealed by a county clerk years back. The officer's eyebrows rose as he skimmed the stamps. The ink had faded, but the names were there. My name in black type. "This is my house. I bought it. The deed is in my name." Karen's volume didn't lower. She ratcheted it higher. "Don't listen to him. He forged those papers. I'm the HOA president. He's trespassing and harassing me." The cadence was something I'd heard before. The way people ramp up outrage when a fact threatens a narrative they've already sold. Her hands drew dramatic circles in the air, and she looked like she was trying to persuade not the officers, but the folding chairs of onlookers. Then a neighbor's voice cut through. "That's his house, Karen. Everyone knows the old owner sold it to him." It was a single line from someone who'd lived there long enough to know names and transactions and who watered whose azaleas. That line widened the crack in her confidence. The officer seeking proof turned to Karen. "Ma'am, can you show us documentation that this property falls under your HOA's jurisdiction?" She dug into a purse with fingers that were shaking now, not with fury, but with a dawning panic. Out came a paper, a printout from Google Maps with a circle crudely penciled around a handful of houses. It looked like something you print to show a friend which coffee shop to find you in. The officer held it, then looked at me. This doesn't prove anything, he said. Karen stepped closer, spittle fine with fury, and hissed, "People like you don't belong here. You'll ruin the neighborhood." There was a brittle note beneath the rage. Fear. She shoved me, a quick, hard yank at the shoulder to create space, to make me the problem the police had been called to fix. The officers responded immediately. "Ma'am, back away," one ordered. She did not. She shouted then, "Arrest him! He's dangerous!" Dangerous. Such a small word, so heavy when dropped into the wrong hands. The street inhaled. Everyone looked at me as if I might show teeth. The cop watching me didn't flinch. He just watched my face for the truth. I could have smiled. The man who'd labeled me the wrong thing had just handed me leverage. I unzipped my backpack and took out a small leather wallet I'd used for years. Inside, the badge rested. Gold, not garish, but undeniable. Even without the uniform, the metal wrote a story the same way my deed did. There was a low murmur from the crowd as sunlight hit the badge, and the neighbors' faces changed from curiosity to recognition. Karen's smirk slithered away like smoke. The officer's stance softened from suspicion to calculated interest. "Detective?" he asked, more in acknowledgement than in a question. I gave my name, told him I'd transferred last month, explained I'd bought the property and was just trying to move in. Karen's eyes widened. Panic wrote new lines on her face. She scrambled. "He's lying," she cried, but the tone was frayed now, less theatrical and more pleading. A neighbor who'd been standing with a hose in his hand raised his phone. "Karen, you told us the house was abandoned," he said. Other phones came up.
The mood on the block shifted. Stories floated up, simple, steady, small acts of petty tyranny. A notice slapped to a door for a bike left out. A fine threatened for a bush not trimmed to her liking. A whispered threat to report people for imagined infractions. Each story was a pebble in the pond to make bigger ripples. Karen, frantic, reached for a phone and made another call, this time lower voiced and faster. I heard fragments, private security, and remove them. She put the phone away as if it had the answer inside. 10 minutes later, a black SUV rolled around the corner, and two men stepped out, wearing cheap polo shirts and laminated badges hung on lanyards that flapped like flags. They chewed gum and walked with the bravado that belonged in cheap movies, not in actual enforcement action. "Take him away," Karen ordered, like she was putting a tip in the jar. The men swaggered forward. "Stand down," I said, and there was steel in the line. "You're about to impersonate law enforcement." The real officer stiffened. "Show us your credentials," one snapped. The men fumbled and produced laminated cards with badges printed on them, plastic and glossy and wrong. The officer snatched one, flipped it. His jaw tightened. "This isn't valid," he said. His partner moved, hand already near a wrist cuff. Karen tried to bluster. "They work for the HOA," she lied. The neighbors, who'd climbed out of porches and paused on stoops, raised their phones. My porch-light camera was a little black eye on the house, and his lens was pointed right at Karen. I pointed to the camera. "Everything is being recorded. Your fake notices, the phony security, the false 911 call." And then the officer said the words that felt like both a victory and a warning. "Ma'am, impersonating law enforcement is a federal offense." For the first time, she looked small. Her voice snagged. "I was protecting the neighborhood," she insisted. Desperation hollowed the words. The officers moved in. The faux security men were lined up against the SUV, their hands behind their heads like characters in a cheap cop drama. Karen was guided toward a squad car with the same gentle firmness someone uses when guiding a fragile animal into a carrier. Neighbors, who might have struck deals with her isolation and petty rules for years, stepped forward. One after another, they told short, sharp tales of fines that had stalked porch corners, of notices taped to doors like a scarlet letter, of a woman who'd slipped into a role she had no right to play and used it like a cudgel. It was catharsis. It was tempering. The officers took statements, took photos of the bogus badges, photographed the Google Maps printout with the circle, and even the copy-paste notices halfway torn and discarded on a lawn. "We'll be filing charges," one officer told me. A list of them: impersonation, filing a false police report, harassment. It felt thorough, the kind of bureaucracy that eats bravado and leaves only paperwork and consequences. Neighbors clapped. Some cheered. There was an odd, guilty mix in the sound. Relief that someone had stood up. Shame that it took so long. Exhilaration at seeing a small tyranny toppled. An older man who'd watched from his porch for as long as he could remember ambled over and put his hand on my shoulder. "Son," he said, voice rough as gravel, "we've been waiting for someone to stand up to her." It felt less like gratitude and more like a passing of responsibility, like we've been waiting, all of us, for the neighborhood to reclaim its streets. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes after a long watch. The boxes were still there, and there would be evenings with bare floors and the smell of paint and the tick of missing screws. There would be calls to a lawyer and mail to redirect. But for the first night since I signed on the dotted line, I felt like the house might be home in the making. We talked there on the porch as police forms were checked and the SUV idled, engine a low buzz. Someone offered coffee from a thermos. Someone else brought a folding chair. Conversation spilled, gardening tips, recommended handymen, and offered to help hang a shelf. The neighborhood had come back to life in a simple, human way. People realized they were not spectators, they were witnesses, and witnesses could be louder than one person with a stack of counterfeit authority. Later, an officer walked me through the steps they would take: statements to file, evidence secured, contacts for the county attorney. "We've seen this before," he said. "It's not as rare as you'd hope." His tone was practical, not heroic. The paperwork would happen. The law would move at its own pace. For now, the immediate danger was contained. I went through the house that night and left a few boxes unopened, letting the day's adrenaline settle in the cardboard. The porch camera would upload the footage. Phones would have videos. The evidence would sit like a slow, immovable weight against the stories Karen had told about control and fear. I thought about my kids, how small they'd seem on these stairs when they were finally home, and what it meant to teach them about standing up without starting fights, about proof and patience, and the quiet certainty of paperwork. As I stacked the last moving box in an empty corner, I thought about the nature of people like Karen, how easy it is to create rules when others follow, or to draw a circle on a map and call it a kingdom. The hunger for control is a small, repetitive thing. It survives on small humiliations and grows when neighbors keep their heads down. But it withers when someone holds up a name, a deed, a badge, and says, "No." Sleep that night was the kind that comes in measured waves, not the absolute, unabashed sleep of a person without worries, but the sleep of someone who knows they've bought themselves a chance, a pause in the mechanics of fear. The block was quiet. The porch light blinked in the dark like a watchful eye. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and let its notifications pulse into the night. Messages of support trickled in from folks who had seen the videos and felt something loosen, like an old dog being petted after too many days of only being fed. In the days that followed, neighborly networks did what paperwork does slowly. They held up a different shape of power. People volunteered to check in on elderly homes, to mow a lawn when the person fell sick, to make sure notice takers had to answer to the people who lived there. I filed the necessary documents and spoke with the detective who'd taken my initial statement. The county attorney did what county attorneys do, reviewed the evidence, and said, not dramatically but with necessary certainty, that there be charges. Karen's name would now be bound to a set of papers that spelled out consequences and that, stubbornly, mattered. There were little victories. Neighbors who once nodded politely now waved, who used to avert their eyes now stopped to chat. The kid with the bicycle left it on the lawn and it stayed put. A mail carrier who always passed me quick smiles now paused to ask how the night had gone. The porch, where I had stacked boxes and where the camera had stared, became not just a border, but a small forum of real encounters, a bench for tools, a shelf for a plant, a place where real voices limited the pretenders. People like Karen don't always vanish forever. They recede and wait for new cracks. But the block had learned a deeper lesson about evidence and community. That lesson is what would do the most to keep the neighborhood safe. The knowledge that each front porch is watched not by one self-appointed czar, but by a chorus of people who might not always agree, but who would not stand by silently while someone pretended to be law. As I finally set a plant on the windowsill and fluffed out a throw pillow, the house felt less like a project and more like a place with corners to fill. The badge hung in my closet for a night, then went back to the wallet. The deeds stayed in my folder because that was where they belonged, safe, steady, legal. The porch camera kept its quiet constant, a black eye that didn't judge but recorded. If Karen ever tried again, she'd have to reckon with tapes and witnesses and the inconvenient fact that the people she had preached to had found their voices. For now, as dusk gathered and the street lamps cast long rectangles across the pavement, my neighbors and I had something that mattered more than any plastic badge or printed notice. We had one another. And on nights when the world felt uncertain, that turns out to be the sort of authority worth trusting.